The rear wheel of Winifred Gentry's wagon cracked clean through its hub on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1874, which was, by her private accounting, the absolute worst possible moment for anything else in her life to go wrong. She sat on the buckboard with the reins slack in her hands and stared at the dust rising from the broken spokes, at the way the entire left rear corner of the wagon had sunk to the earth like something defeated, and she pressed her lips together so tightly that the blood left them entirely. She would not cry. She had not cried since the day they buried her father in the rocky soil outside of Amarillo, and she was not about to start on the open stretch of trail between Caldwell, Kansas, and whatever uncertain future awaited her in the town of Beaumont's Crossing, which sat another 14 miles to the west and might as well have been sitting on the surface of the moon. The year was 1874, and the Kansas plains stretched in every direction without apology. The sky above was enormous and pale blue and utterly indifferent. The grass moved in long, slow waves to the north. To the south, a line of cottonwood trees marked the shallow bend of a creek she hadn't managed to reach before the wheel gave out. She was 24 years old, she was alone, and she had $63 folded into the lining of her boot, which was everything she owned in the world apart from what was loaded in the wagon bed. She climbed down carefully, her boots finding the dry earth, and she walked around to the damaged wheel and crouched beside it. The hub was split. The iron tire had sprung loose on one side, and two of the wooden spokes had sheared off at their shoulders. She understood enough about wagon mechanics to know she could not fix this herself. She understood enough about the Kansas plain to know that standing alone on an empty trail was not something a woman did indefinitely without consequence. She straightened up and shaded her eyes and looked in both directions along the trail. Nothing moved except the grass and a red-tailed hawk riding a thermal to the south. She walked back to the buckboard and sat on the edge of it and folded her hands in her lap and made herself think practically, the way her father had always instructed her to think when things went bad. Her father had been a practical man. James Gentry had run a dry goods store in Amarillo for 11 years, and he had raised Winifred to take inventory, to balance a ledger, to assess a situation before she reacted to it. He had died in March of a winter fever that came on fast and left no room for argument, and he had left her the store, which had debts against it that she had not known about, and a letter of introduction to a man named Harlan Cobb who ran a mercantile in Beaumont's Crossing and was willing to take on a capable woman as a partner and bookkeeper. She had sold what she could to pay down the worst of the debts, packed what remained of value, and pointed herself west. She had been pointed west for 6 days now. She had camped 3 nights under the wagon and 2 nights at a small way station run by a family named Prout who had fed her venison stew and asked her politely where she was going and why. She had been within 14 miles of her destination when the wheel decided it had carried its last load. She heard the horse before she saw it. The sound came from the east from behind her, a steady 4-beat rhythm on the hard-packed trail, unhurried, neither fast nor slow. She turned and looked and saw a rider coming out of the morning haze at a walk, a dark bay horse with a white blaze, and on the horse a man whose silhouette was all hat and shoulders, and the easy, upright posture of someone who had spent more hours in the saddle than out of it. He was still some distance away when Winifred made the unconscious decision to stand up straight and set her shoulders back. Not out of vanity, out of something closer to dignity. The rider drew closer, and she could see him more clearly now. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a year or two either side of that. He wore a dusty brown coat and dark canvas trousers tucked into worn boots, and the hat on his head was a wide-brimmed affair in a color that had probably once been tan, and was now the same shade as everything else on the Kansas plain. His face was lean and weathered, and he had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same sandstone as the bluffs along the Cimarron. He rode with his hands easy on the reins, and his dark eyes moved from the wagon to the wheel to Winifred herself in a single, slow, measuring sweep. He pulled the bay horse to a stop about 10 feet from the wagon. He looked at the wheel. He looked at Winifred. He did not say anything. Winifred, who had been raised to speak plainly and to waste neither words nor time, met his gaze directly. "The hub is cracked through," she said, "and 2 spokes are gone. I don't have the tools to fix it myself." He swung down from the horse in a single fluid motion, dropped the reins so the bay would ground tie, and walked toward the wheel. He crouched beside it the same way she had, but with the confident stillness of someone who already knew what he was looking at before he got close enough to see it clearly. He turned the tire with one hand, examined the hub, looked at the broken spokes. He pressed 2 fingers against the crack in the hub and felt the extent of it. He stood up and walked to his saddlebags. He began unpacking tools that she would not have expected a lone rider to carry. A mallet, a drawknife, a set of wooden wedges, a coil of wire that was heavier gauge than it appeared, a short iron bar with a forked end. He laid these things in the dust beside the wheel with deliberate care, each item placed in a specific arrangement that suggested he had done this before many times and had a particular order he preferred. He took off his coat and folded it over the saddle and rolled up his sleeves, and he went to work. He did not ask her to help. He did not explain what he was doing. He did not make the kind of easy, social conversation that most men made when they found themselves in close proximity to a lone woman on the trail. The inquiries about where she was headed, where she'd come from, whether she had family, whether she was married. He said nothing at all. He worked with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful to watch. He used the iron bar to pry the tire free from the remaining spokes so he could access the hub directly. He took 2 replacement spokes from a bundle he unwrapped from a piece of oilcloth in his saddlebag, and they were close enough in dimension to serve. He fitted them with the drawknife and the mallet with precise, confident strikes. He packed the cracked hub with something from a small tin that smelled of pine resin, and then wound the heavy wire around it in a tight spiral, using the iron bar and a technique she had never seen before to tension the wire so that it bit into the wood and compressed the crack closed. It was not a permanent repair. She understood that, but it was solid, and it would hold through 14 miles of flat trail without difficulty, and probably considerably farther than that if she was careful. He set the tire back and tapped it into alignment with the mallet. He spun the wheel on its axle and watched it turn. He made one small adjustment with the iron bar and spun it again and seemed satisfied. He packed his tools back into his saddlebags with the same deliberate care with which he had unpacked them. He pulled his coat off the saddle and put it back on. He took up the reins. He looked at Winifred, and then he tipped his hat to her, that wide-brimmed battered hat, a single, unhurried motion, his fingers touching the brim and his chin dropping the smallest degree in what was unmistakably a gesture of respect, courteous and complete. He turned the bay horse and started to ride away, heading west along the same trail she was traveling, and he did not look back. Winifred stood in the dust and the morning light and watched him go, and she felt something strange and warm move through her chest, some feeling she did not immediately have a name for. And she thought, without quite meaning to, that she had never in her life seen a man work with such quiet dignity, or offer a kindness so completely without expectation of anything in return. She climbed back onto the buckboard and took up the reins and clucked to her horses, a pair of reliable sorrels named Abraham and Mary after the late president and his wife, names her father had given them because he had been a great admirer of Lincoln's. The wagon moved forward and the repaired wheel held firm, and ahead of her on the trail the rider had already diminished to a small dark shape against the wide pale sky, pulling steadily away. She found herself watching him longer than she needed to. Beaumont's Crossing was a town that had decided to exist and was still in the early stages of arguing itself into permanence. It had come up along a creek crossing on the cattle trail that ran north from Texas, and it had the look of a place where some buildings had plans to stay and others were merely visiting. The main street ran east to west and had a mercantile, a livery, a small hotel called the Cattlemen's Rest, a doctor's office, a barber shop, a land office, a saloon called the Prairie Rose, and a scatter of smaller establishments that served various purposes. There were perhaps 300 people in and around the town, not counting the drovers who came through with the cattle herds in season. Winifred pulled her wagon to a stop in front of the Beaumont Crossing Mercantile at 2:30 in the afternoon. The sign above the door was hand-lettered in careful black paint, H. Cobb & Son, General Merchandise, EST, 1871. She set the brake and climbed down and tied Abraham and Mary to the hitching post and went inside. Harlan Cobb was a broad, florid man of about 50, with a fringe of white hair around a gleaming head, and the good-natured, slightly calculating eyes of a man who had spent his life making deals. His son, Edgar, was 19 and had his father's build and his mother's uncertain disposition, and stood behind the counter looking as though he had not yet made up his mind about the world. Harlan Cobb read her father's letter of introduction twice, folded it carefully, and extended his hand. "Miss Gentry," he said warmly, "your father wrote to me very highly of your abilities. I was sorry to hear of his passing, very sorry indeed. He was a good man." "He was," Winifred said simply. "You'll want to see the books," Cobb said. "I won't pretend they're in excellent order. That's precisely why I need someone who can make sense of them. Edgar has many fine qualities, but figures are not among them." He smiled with the easy self-deprecation of a man who had made peace with his son's limitations. "I have a room prepared above the store. Nothing grand, but it's clean and it has a good window. You'll take your meals with our family." It was a fair arrangement, better than she had allowed herself to hope. She thanked him and went back outside to begin unloading what she needed from the wagon, and she was pulling a wooden crate from the bed when a voice behind her said, "That looks heavier than it ought to be." She turned and found herself looking at a woman about her own age, perhaps a year older, with a wide, frank face and dark auburn hair, and a calico dress that showed the evidence of a vigorous and practical life. The woman was already reaching for the other handle of the crate. "I'm Della Marsh," the woman said. "My husband runs the livery. You must be the bookkeeper Harlan's been expecting." "Winifred Gentry," Winifred said. "And yes." "We'll get along," Della said with cheerful certainty, as though she had done the calculation quickly and arrived at a definitive answer. "Let me help you with these." Together they carried Winifred's things up the narrow staircase to the room above the store, which was indeed clean and had indeed a good window that looked out over the main street. While they worked, Della talked in the comfortable, informative way of someone who understood that a newcomer needed knowledge and was happy to provide it. She explained who owned what and who was feuding with whom, and who was honest and who required watching. She pointed out the window at various buildings and supplied brief, pointed histories. She mentioned that Beaumont's Crossing had been without a proper schoolteacher for 8 months, that the town council was in moderate disarray over the question of a new water pump for the public well, and that the Prairie Rose Saloon had changed ownership twice in 3 years, and the current owner, a man named Burl Meacham, was neither better nor worse than his predecessors. "And the cowboys who come through with the cattle," Winifred asked, "are they generally troublesome?" Della considered this with the fair-mindedness of someone who tried not to generalize. "Some are," she said. "Most aren't. They're tired men doing hard work and the town treats them accordingly. There are exceptions." She paused, seeming to weigh something. "There's one who comes through every season and stays a week or two, quiet man, never causes trouble, does odd jobs for folks while he's here and then moves on. Ira Dalton, his name is." Something moved in Winifred's memory, not a name she recognized, but an image, a lean, weathered face, a pair of dark eyes that looked at a broken wheel with the calm certainty of someone who knew how to fix it. "Does he ride a dark bay horse with a white blaze?" she asked. Della looked at her with curiosity. "He does, as a matter of fact. I met him on the trail," Winifred said. "My wagon wheel broke. He stopped and repaired it." She paused, then added, because it seemed relevant, "He didn't say a single word the entire time." "That sounds right," Della said. Ira Dalton is the quietest man I have ever known in my life, and I grew up with 4 brothers, so I have a full range of comparison. My husband Cyrus says the man could go a month without speaking and not feel the loss of it. Winifred filed this information away with the careful, organized instinct of a woman who had spent her life managing a store's worth of facts and figures. She turned to look out the window at the main street below, and as she looked, a dark bay horse with a white blaze walked past in the direction of the livery, and on its back was the man in the battered tan hat, his back straight, his hands easy on the reins. She watched him until he turned into the livery's entrance and disappeared. "He's a good man," Della said quietly from somewhere behind her. "Whatever else I can tell you about this town, that part I can tell you with certainty." The first week in Beaumont's Crossing passed in the focused, absorbing work of bringing Harlan Cobb's accounts into some semblance of order. The books were not as bad as she had feared, but they were significantly worse than Cobb had implied, with invoices in 3 different places, and a system of credit advanced to customers that had been tracked in a method she could only describe as optimistic. She worked at the small desk Cobb set up for her in the back of the store, and she worked methodically, and by the end of the week she had a clear picture of where things stood and a proposed system for going forward that Cobb accepted with the gratitude of a man who had been finding water where he expected it to be dry. She fell into the rhythms of the town the way she fell into most things, practically and without excessive sentiment. She took her meals with the Cobb family at the long table in their house behind the store, where Harlan talked about cattle prices and local politics, and his wife Margaret served excellent biscuits and listened to everyone with the composed attention of a woman who had made an art of it. She walked to the dry goods merchant 2 doors down when Cobb needed supplies he didn't stock himself, and she learned whose credit was good and whose required careful watching, and she visited Della Marsh at the livery in her free hours because Della was honest and funny and made no demands on Winifred's time or energy that were not freely offered. She saw Ira Dalton twice that first week. The first time was at the hardware merchant's, where she was picking up a new ledger book. He was at the counter buying a length of chain and a handful of iron staples, and he did not see her, or if he did, gave no indication of it. She watched him from across the store with the particular attentiveness she now recognized as something more than casual interest, and she noticed again the precise economy of his movements, the way he communicated with the merchant through a combination of pointing and brief nods, the way he counted his coins out exactly and picked up his purchases and turned to go. He saw her then. He stopped. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, level eyes, and in them she could read, or thought she could read, a complicated flash of recognition and something that might have been surprise at finding her here. He tipped his hat, a replication of the gesture on the trail so exact it might have been practiced. Then he walked out. She stood holding her ledger book and feeling as though the air in the hardware store had shifted its quality in some indefinable way. The second time was on Saturday evening, when the main street of Beaumont's Crossing came to its modest weekly life, with families come in from the outlying homesteads to trade, and the cowboys from the nearby ranches letting off the week's accumulated steam. She was walking with Della back from the pastor's wife's small informal gathering when she saw him sitting on the steps of the hotel in the early evening light, with a cup of coffee balanced on his knee and his hat pushed back on his head. He was watching the street with the still, unhurried attention of someone who found the world genuinely interesting, without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. Della said, "Evening, Ira," as they passed, easy and familiar, and he nodded and touched the brim of his hat. Winifred made herself keep walking and not look back. "He makes me curious," she told Della later, when they were sitting on the steps of the livery in the cooling dark. "Most people who meet him say that," Della agreed. "Cyrus says Ira came to town 4 years ago with nothing but the horse and the tools and a bedroll, and nobody knows where from, and he never said." He does good work and he pays his way and he's never given anyone cause for trouble, and in Beaumont's Crossing those three things are enough to make a man welcome. Does he have family? None that anyone knows of. None he's mentioned. Winifred was quiet for a moment, listening to the creak and the distant sounds of the Saturday evening going on somewhere up the street. Does he ever talk? To anyone? Della smiled. He talks to Cyrus some, short sentences, about horses and whether the creek's running high. My husband says it's like having a conversation with a very intelligent and exceptionally well-mannered mountain. He talks to the pastor occasionally. And he talked to old Martha Hensley when her husband was sick last spring, apparently sat with her for an hour while the doctor was with Harold. And Martha says he was kind and present in a way that most talkers never manage. Winifred thought about a man who could fix a stranger's wagon wheel in the middle of the Kansas plain without asking a single question or extracting a single obligation, and who could sit with a frightened old woman for an hour and make her feel less alone, and she thought that silence used well was perhaps a more generous thing than words used carelessly. The second week, she spoke to him. It happened at the Mercantile. He came in on a Wednesday morning when Cobb was in the back taking delivery of flour sacks and Edgar was off on an errand, and Winifred was alone at the counter, making notations in the new ledger. He came in and stood at the counter and put down a small piece of paper on which was written a list of supplies in a hand that was careful and deliberate, as though he had taken time with it. She looked at the list. Coffee, dried beans, salt, 2 yards of heavy canvas, a spool of waxed thread. She began to fill the order, moving along the shelves with the efficiency of a woman who had grown up behind a counter and knew where everything was by instinct. "You came all the way to Beaumont's Crossing," she said, while her back was to him, reaching for the coffee tin. It was not quite a question. She turned and set the coffee on the counter and found him looking at her with an expression she was beginning to understand held more information than it appeared to. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. "I mean that you were on the same trail I was on," she said, "and I arrived here, and you arrived here, and I wonder if that's where you were headed all along." He looked at her for another moment, and then slowly he nodded. "You pass through here often," she said. "Della Marsh told me you come every season." He nodded again. "I'm going to be here permanently," she said. She set the rest of his items on the counter. "I'm Winifred Gentry. I'm Mr. Cobb's new bookkeeper." She extended her hand across the counter the way she would have extended it to any business acquaintance. He looked at her hand, and then he reached across and took it, and his hand was large and very warm and rough with the kind of calluses that come from years of real work, and the handshake was firm and brief and entirely proper. "Ira Dalton," he said. It was the first time she had heard his voice. It was low and somewhat rough, like a door that had not been opened in some time but still had good hinges. "I know," she said pleasantly. "Della told me." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that might, with a more expressive face, have been a smile. He paid for his goods and took them and left, and Winifred stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed and put her hand flat on the surface of the counter and felt the warm grain of the wood under her palm and breathed very carefully. She was going to have to be sensible about this. The problem with being sensible about it was that the town of Beaumont's Crossing was not especially large, and Ira Dalton, for all his quietness, was not a man who was easy to overlook. She saw him most mornings at some point in her walk to the store, either at the livery or at the well, or crossing the street toward the hardware merchant with some specific purpose in mind. He was doing work for various people around town, she learned, the kind of work that accumulated in any small community when there was no one specifically assigned to do it. He mended a section of the fence around the widow Carson's property without being asked. He helped the blacksmith, Ogden, reset a massive anvil that had cracked its mounting. He spent 3 days repairing the roof of the small schoolhouse, which stood empty and in need of maintenance while the town went on arguing about a teacher. She watched him work on the schoolhouse roof on the second day, from the window of the Mercantile, and she was struck again by that quality of absolute focused attention he brought to whatever task was in front of him. He moved across the pitched roof with a sure-footedness that was almost animal, and he worked steadily without stopping to rest or to look around at the world. And the work that appeared when he had passed over a section was clean and permanent-looking. On the third day she brought him a pail of water. It was a practical gesture. It was a warm afternoon, and the sun on the dark shingles was considerable, and she happened to be walking past with the pail because she had been to the well on an errand for Margaret Cobb. At least, that was what she told herself. She set the pail at the base of the ladder and called up, "There's water here if you want it." He appeared at the edge of the roof and looked down at her. "It's a warm day," she said, and then felt slightly foolish for saying something so obvious. He came down the ladder and drank from the tin cup she'd hung on the pail, and he drank with the direct, unself-conscious thirst of someone who had been working hard, and when he handed the cup back his eyes met hers with a look that was unhurried and entirely present, the way all his attention was, as though whatever he was looking at was the only thing in the world for the moment he was looking at it. "Thank you," he said. "You're fixing the whole roof," she said. He looked up at the schoolhouse and then back at her. "Needs it," he said, in a tone that suggested this was the complete and sufficient explanation. "The council has been arguing about the school for 8 months, she said. The roof and the teacher and the curriculum and who should fund what. Meanwhile, the children who need it aren't getting their education." He listened to this with that particular quality of attention that she was beginning to recognize as one of his most distinctive characteristics, the sense that he was actually taking in what was being said and considering it honestly rather than simply waiting for a gap in which to insert his own opinion. "You grew up going to school?" he asked. 2 complete sentences in one conversation. She was learning to count them. "My father taught me most of what I know," she said, "but I had 2 years of proper schooling in Amarillo. It mattered." She paused. "Did you?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Some." She did not push. She was learning his rhythms, the way you learn the rhythms of a creek, where it runs fast and where it pools still. "Well," she said, picking up the pail, "the water is there if you want more." She walked back to the store and she did not look back, and she did her afternoon's work with the particular focused determination of a woman who was being extremely careful not to think about something. October moved through Beaumont's crossing and brought the first cold and the last of the season's cattle drives. 2 large herds came through within a week of each other, and the town swelled briefly with trail hands who spent their pay at the Prairie Rose and the Mercantile, and then departed northward toward Dodge City and the railheads. Winifred balanced the books for the surge in business and helped stock the shelves and worked longer hours, and she found the work satisfying in the way that useful work always was. Harlan Cobb was pleased with her. He said so on multiple occasions, with the frank satisfaction of a man who had made a good business decision and knew it. He gave her a small raise at the end of October and offered, tentatively, the possibility that if the coming year was profitable, she might take on a proper partnership stake in the business. She thanked him and did not let herself think about the future too specifically, because the future in 1874 on the Kansas plain was not something you could plan with too much confidence. The town council resolved its argument about the school at the end of October, or rather, stopped arguing about it in the way that small community bodies sometimes stop arguing, not because the argument is settled, but because everyone is too tired to continue it. They agreed to fund one teacher's salary from the town account and to use the schoolhouse, whose roof was now, thanks to Ira Dalton, in considerably better condition than the council's deliberations. They posted a notice seeking applicants. Winifred saw the notice and read it and thought about it for 2 days and then went to speak to Harlan Cobb about adjusting her hours. She told him she wanted to teach the morning sessions, which would run from 7 until noon, and then keep her afternoon hours in the Mercantile from 1 until 5. Cobb, who was a man of flexible and practical intelligence when it suited him, thought about this for about 30 seconds and agreed. He pointed out that a bookkeeper who was also the school teacher would be a person of considerable standing in the community, which would not harm his store's reputation. Winifred did not mention this consideration because it had already occurred to her. She applied to the council, was accepted after an interview with 3 council members, who asked her various questions about arithmetic and history and the Bible, and she took the position beginning the first Monday of November with 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Teaching was not bookkeeping, but it engaged a similar part of her mind, the part that liked order and systems and the satisfaction of watching something move from confusion into clarity. She discovered she was good at it. She liked the children, with their particular mixture of earnestness and testing energy, and she liked the challenge of meeting each of them where they were and moving them forward from there. November was cold and bright, and she walked to the schoolhouse in the mornings wearing her heaviest coat and the wool hat she'd knitted on the trail. And one morning in the second week of November, she arrived at the schoolhouse to find that someone had stacked a cord of firewood neatly against the north wall, which was the sheltered side, where the wind didn't reach it. There was no note. There was no indication of who had done it. She stood and looked at the firewood for a long time in the cold morning light. She asked Della later. Della looked at her with an expression that was carefully neutral. "I really couldn't say," she said. "You could," Winifred said. "You're choosing not to." Della's neutral expression wavered into a smile. "I think you already know," she said. Winifred knew. That afternoon she walked to the livery where Cyrus Marsh, who was a compact, cheerful man with enormous mustaches, was working on a wagon axle. She asked him if Ira Dalton was around. "He's in the back paddock," Cyrus said, without looking up. "Working with that young mare that came in from the Bradshaw ranch. She's been giving everybody trouble." She went through the livery and out the back gate to the paddock. Ira was in the paddock with a young chestnut mare who was eyeing him with a combination of suspicion and curiosity that Winifred thought she could understand. He was standing very still near the center of the paddock, not approaching the horse, just existing in the same space, and the mare was circling him at a distance, not fleeing but not yet ready to trust. Winifred leaned on the fence rail and watched. He didn't look at her, but she thought he knew she was there. The mare circled once more and then stopped and looked at him for a long moment and then took 3 steps toward him. He remained entirely still. She took 2 more steps. He let her come until she was close enough to breathe on his shoulder. And then, very slowly, without looking at her directly, he raised one hand and let her smell it. It took another 10 minutes, slow and patient, before he put a hand on her neck and the mare stood still and let him. He walked the mare to the fence and tied her loosely to the rail and turned to look at Winifred, and his face was the closest she had seen it to something open. There was quiet satisfaction in it. "You stacked that wood," she said. He looked at the mare's neck and smoothed a hand down it and said nothing. "There are 15 children in that school," she said. "They're going to be warm because of that wood. I want to thank you." He looked at her then. His eyes were very dark, and in the afternoon light they had a quality that she was running out of ways to describe to herself. She settled on honest. His eyes were very honest. "You don't need to," he said. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to. There's a difference." Something in his expression shifted, subtle as the movement of light across the plains when a cloud passes. He nodded once. "Will you have supper with the Cobbs and me tonight?" she asked. It came out before she had thoroughly considered it, and she did not take it back. "Margaret sets a good table, and Harlan would enjoy the company, I think, and I would like it if you came." He was quiet for a long moment. The mare blew softly through her nose and rested her chin on the fence rail. "All right," he said. Margaret Cobb was a woman of genuine social talent who made guests feel comfortable without effort, and she applied this talent to Ira Dalton with a warmth that was neither condescending nor excessive. She simply made room for him at the table and passed the dishes and talked to him when she talked to everyone, and did not treat his quiet as a problem to be solved. Harlan told stories about the cattle business, and Edgar ate his supper with the absorption of someone whose principal interest was in the food, and the evening moved pleasantly. Ira ate with the focused appreciation of a man who did not take good food for granted, and he spoke 4 or 5 times over the course of the meal, short and considered statements that fit precisely into the conversation without jostling it. He said the biscuits were the best he'd had in Kansas. He said he thought the spring would bring more settlers through, given the railroad's new survey line he'd heard discussed in Dodge City. He asked Harlan a question about the local water rights dispute that showed he had been paying attention to the town's business. After supper, he helped Margaret clear the table without being asked, carrying the dishes to the kitchen with the same unassuming practicality with which he did everything. And then he put on his hat and coat and thanked Margaret with a quiet sincerity that made her smile in a way that told Winifred clearly that Ira Dalton had made another ally. Winifred walked out with him to the street. The night was very cold and very clear, and the stars over Beaumont's crossing were enormous and brilliant in the way they only were in that high, clear air, far from anything that made light. They stood on the porch step for a moment in the cold, and the street was quiet, and she could see the light from the prairie rose at the far end and hear the distant sound of a piano playing something that had started life as a hymn and been modified for secular purposes. "I'm glad you came," she said. He looked at the stars for a moment, the way he sometimes looked at things that required acknowledgement but not immediate response, and then he looked at her. "Thank you for the invitation," he said. "You could come again," she said, and then added before she could stop herself, "if you wanted to." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. He looked at her with that honest, unhurried gaze. "I'd like that," he said. He put on his hat and walked off down the street toward the hotel, and she stood on the porch in the cold and watched him go, and she thought, standing there under all those enormous stars, that she was in very real danger of losing her practical heart to a man who communicated mostly in gestures and the quality of his attention. She found, to her surprise, that she did not particularly mind. November deepened into December, and the cold settled over the Kansas plain in earnest. The creek iced at the edges, and the morning smelled of wood smoke from every chimney in town, and the children in the schoolhouse sat in coats until the stove heated the room, which it did efficiently because Winifred had learned from Ira which wood burned hottest and longest. He came to supper at the Cobbs twice more in November, and both times the evenings were warm and easy in the way that good company makes an evening, and she learned more about him in those hours than she had in all the weeks before, not from what he said, but from what she observed. The way he laughed, quietly and without performance, at Harlan's stories. The way he listened to Edgar talk about a horse he admired with the full, generous attention he gave to everything. The way he thanked Margaret and meant it in a way that was visible without being demonstrated. She learned from Cyrus Marsh that Ira had come from Missouri originally, that he had worked cattle trails since he was 18, which would have been roughly 12 years ago, which made him about 30, which was what she had estimated, that he had served briefly in the tail end of the war on the Union side, a fact Cyrus mentioned without elaboration, and which Ira had never raised himself, and which she filed away carefully without drawing conclusions she didn't have enough information to support. She learned from Ira himself. In the gradual and non-linear way she learned most things about him, that he had taught himself to read from a Bible and a copy of a Dickens novel he'd found in an abandoned house on the Missouri plain when he was about 9 years old, and that he had strong opinions about Dickens that he expressed in 3 terse and accurate sentences when she mentioned she'd read Bleak House. He thought Dickens was overlong. She told him that was the point. He considered this and said he supposed he could see that. She learned that he had opinions about horses, about carpentry, about the particular qualities of different types of wood, and about the ethics of the cattle business, which were more complex and carefully considered opinions than she expected. He told her, on a cold December evening when they had walked briefly along the creek while the light lasted, that the expansion of the cattle ranges was pushing against the rights and lives of people who had been here first, and that this troubled him, and that he did not know what an individual man could do about it except to try to treat every person he encountered with the same fairness he would want applied to himself. She looked at him as he said this, his breath visible in the cold air, and she thought that he was the most genuinely considered man she had met in her life. "My father believed the same thing," she said, "that you begin with the person in front of you. It's the only place you can begin," he said. She was wearing her heavy coat, and the wool hat and her hands were in her pockets, and the light on the ice at the edge of the creek was going orange with the setting sun, and she thought that if she reached out her hand he would take it, and she did not reach out her hand because she was still being sensible, but the wanting of it was clear and real and warm in her chest despite the cold. Christmas came to Beaumont's Crossing with the modest festivity of a frontier town that had sufficient goodwill but limited resources for celebration. The pastor organized a gathering on Christmas Eve, and Margaret Cobb provided 3 pies that were received with appropriate reverence, and the schoolchildren performed a brief and enthusiastic program that involved 2 songs and a recitation of scripture by the oldest student, a boy named Gerald Plum, who was 14 and extremely serious about everything. Winifred had told the children about the program in mid-December, and they had applied themselves to the rehearsals with a willingness that she suspected was partly genuine enthusiasm and partly the wish to please her, and she was moved by both. On Christmas Eve, watching them in the lamplight of the pastor's gathering, she felt a pang for her father, who had loved Christmas and had always made it a real occasion even in the lean years when the store was struggling, and she missed him with the fresh, specific quality that grief sometimes has when it revisits you unexpectedly. She was standing near the door after the program, watching the rest of the gathering, when she felt rather than heard someone step up beside her. She looked and found Ira standing there, holding a cup of cider, looking at the room. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment, and the warmth of his presence in the cold evening was something she registered with a clarity that surprised her. "My father would have liked tonight," she said quietly. He turned and looked at her, and his face carried the careful attention it always did when she said something that mattered. "He liked celebrations," she said, "even small ones." He said the point of celebrating was not to pretend things were better than they were but to acknowledge what was good. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He sounds like a man who understood things." "He was," she said, and the was hit her in its usual place, that tender spot that would not entirely heal. Ira looked at the room, at the gathered families and the children still bright-eyed from their performance. "What was good tonight," he said, measuring it with the precise care he gave to all his words, "was real." She looked at him. The lamplight in the room was warm and it lit the planes of his face and the darkness of his eyes, and she thought he was, when you looked at him properly, a genuinely handsome man, not in the conventional, easy way that some men were handsome, but in the deeper way, the way that comes from character being written in a face over time. "It was," she agreed. They stood together in the doorway through the rest of the gathering, not talking a great deal, but the silence between them had changed in quality over the weeks they had known each other, and it was no longer the silence of strangers, but the comfortable, warm silence of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms and found they matched. He walked her back to the store afterward through the cold Christmas Eve, and the stars were out in their full winter brilliance, and their boots made the same sound on the frozen ground, and at the door she turned and found him looking at her with an expression that she had not seen before, something open in it that hadn't been there earlier, something that required a certain kind of courage to show. "Merry Christmas, Winifred," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it land in her chest like a perfectly placed note of music. "Merry Christmas, Ira," she said. He tipped his hat and walked away into the cold and the starlight, and she went inside and sat on the edge of her bed in her coat and breathed very carefully for several minutes. Sensible, she told herself, But the warmth in her chest would not be sensible, and she eventually stopped arguing with it. The new year of 1875 came in with a blizzard that laid 2 feet of snow across the Kansas plain and kept Beaumont's crossing indoors for 4 days. The wind was extraordinary, the kind of wind that made the walls of even solid buildings feel like suggestions. Winifred spent those 4 days warm in the mercantile, cataloging an inventory that Cobb had been meaning to do since September, and she was productive and grateful for the work because the alternative was too much time thinking. When the blizzard cleared, and the sun came back onto the white world with a brilliance that was almost painful, she was the first person out on the main street. The snow was mid-calf, and the cold was absolute, but the sky was such an overwhelming blue that it felt worth it. She was standing in the center of the street, looking at the changed world when Ira came around the corner from the direction of the livery, and he stopped when he saw her. She looked at him across the white street, and the distance between them felt, for a moment, exactly like the distance that it was. "Everything all right at the livery?" she called. "Yes," he called back. "Lost one board from the east wall. Horses are fine." "Good," she said. He walked toward her through the snow. He was wearing the brown coat and the battered hat, and he moved through the deep snow with that unhurried physical competence she had come to expect from him. He stopped a few feet away, and they stood together in the new quiet of the post-blizzard world, and looked at the white street and the white rooftops and the absolutely blue sky above it all. "My father used to say that a hard thing, faced and survived, makes the world look cleaner on the other side," she said. He looked at the white world. "He was right," he said. She turned and looked at him, and he was already looking at her, and whatever caution she had been carrying for the past 3 months resolved itself in that moment into something simpler and clearer. "Ira," she said, "I would like very much to know you better. I mean that I would like to spend time with you deliberately, not by accident, not because we happen to be in the same place. I'm telling you plainly because I have found that plain speaking saves everyone a considerable amount of confusion." He looked at her for a long time. The cold air between them was very still. "I know," he said. "I've been trying to find the words." "You've found enough of them," she said, "for this." "I've been trying to find the right ones," he said, "the kind that would be worth saying." She understood, suddenly and completely, that for this man, words were not a casual currency but something he spent with great care because he believed they should mean exactly what they said, and that his silence was not distance but a form of respect, the refusal to say something less true than what he felt. "Tell me the word," she said quietly. He looked at her with those dark, honest eyes, and there was something in them now that was completely uncovered, no reserve, no careful management. "Yes," he said, "all of it, whatever you're offering to share." She smiled then, and it was a real smile, the kind that used her whole face, and she said, "Good, then walk with me. The world is very clean today." He walked with her through the snowed-clean streets of Beaumont's Crossing, and it was the best morning she had spent in Kansas. January and February were cold and internal months, the kind that turned people inward. But for Winifred and Ira, they were months of deliberate and steady discovery, the kind of knowing that builds itself properly, each piece fitted carefully against the last. He came to supper at the Cobbs every week now, and the Cobbs treated him with the comfortable familiarity of people who had accepted him as a regular feature of their household. He helped Cyrus Marsh with projects at the livery in the mornings before the cold set in too hard, and in the afternoons he was often at the mercantile, on some errand of his own, or simply present in the store in the way that people are present in places where they are glad to be. He did not interfere with her work. He sat on the bench near the window and read from whatever book she had most recently lent him, and occasionally she glanced up and found him already looking at her, and neither of them made anything particular of it. They talked in the evenings on the porch of the store, bundled in coats, their breath white in the cold air. They talked about books and about Kansas, and about what made a town worth living in and what made a person worth knowing. She told him about her father's store, and the years of managing it alongside the man who had built it, and what she had learned about both commerce and character from that. He listened with the fullness she had come to depend on and responded with an honesty that matched hers. He told her, in pieces, about his life before Beaumont's crossing. He had grown up poor in Missouri, the youngest of several children of a father who drank and a mother who endured, and he had left at 17 to avoid becoming either of those things. He had worked cattle in Texas, and then trailed north with the herds through Oklahoma Territory and Kansas, and he had developed along the way a comprehensive and practical set of skills and a resolute unwillingness to take up space in the world that he had not earned. He had come to Beaumont's crossing 4 years ago because Cyrus Marsh had offered him steady work for a season, and the season had stretched into a permanent arrangement, though permanent was not a word Ira had used easily until recently. Until recently, she repeated gently. He looked at her across the cold porch, their breath rising together in the still air. Until recently, he confirmed, and the weight in those 2 words was very clear. She put her mittened hand on his arm, where it rested on the porch railing. He looked down at her hand and then at her, and he put his hand over hers carefully, and they stood like that for a while in the winter silence of Beaumont's crossing, and she thought that this was the most content she had been in a very long time. February brought a crisis of a practical nature that interrupted, briefly, the comfortable progression of things. A man named Wade Corbin, who ran a ranch about 12 miles north of town, came into the mercantile on a Tuesday with a grievance about a credit arrangement that Cobb had made the previous autumn, and that Corbin felt had been misrepresented to him. Corbin was a large, loud man with a temper that moved quickly from irritated to belligerent, and he expressed his grievance at a volume that was audible from the back of the store. Winifred came out from the back where she had been working on the accounts and looked at the situation calmly. She had the ledger entries in question in her head because she had just reviewed them that morning. "Mr. Corbin," she said, in a tone that was pleasant and entirely unmoved. "The credit extended to you in September was for $40 against the value of your next sale. The terms were 14% interest over 6 months, which was written into the agreement you signed. I have the document here." She went to the file and retrieved it and put it on the counter. Corbin looked at her with the specific displeasure of a man who had expected to bully a storekeeper and found himself instead facing a composed woman with documentary evidence. He looked at the paper and then at her. "Harlan Cobb presented this differently," he said, less loudly. "Mr. Cobb and I can both review the terms with you," she said. "But the terms are as written and they're fair, and I believe you know it, Mr. Corbin." There was a brief, charged silence. Corbin was not, beneath his bluster, an unreasonable man, or at least not an unintelligent one. He saw the paper and saw the signature and made the calculation that was available to him. "I'll pay what's owed," he said, and the volume had dropped entirely to something approaching normal. "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "Will there be anything else?" He bought a tin of tobacco and left. Ira had come in during the middle of this exchange and had stood near the door without interfering, and after Corbin left he looked at her with that corner-of-the-mouth expression that was his version of a significant smile. "You didn't need help," he said. "I know," she said, "but I noticed you stayed near the door," he nodded. "In case you did." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, meaning it in a specific way that had to do with the fact that he had not jumped in to rescue her when she didn't need rescuing, but had simply made himself available in case the situation changed. That distinction meant something. He understood that she meant it in that specific way. She could tell by the way his expression settled. March arrived and began the slow warming that would become spring, and with the warming came the first signs of the cattle season, drovers moving through singly and in small groups, the distant presence of Texas herds gathering for the long trail north. The town quickened with the seasonal energy of a place that ran partly on cattle money, and the mercantile was busier, and the livery was busier, and Winifred's books reflected the change in a way she found satisfying. On the first Sunday of March, Ira asked her if she would ride out with him to look at the creek in its spring running. He had a horse available from the livery for her, a steady gray mare who had excellent manners, and the day was clear and cold but with the first real warmth in the sun, the kind of warmth that reminds you what summer was. They rode out along the creek for 2 miles in the comfortable, companionable silence that had become one of the reliable pleasures of being with him, and the creek was running full and clear, and the cottonwood trees were beginning their first tentative leafing, the buds breaking into the smallest, most optimistic green. The plain stretched away in all directions under the enormous sky, and hawks circled in the clear air, and somewhere to the south they could hear the distant sound of cattle. She was riding beside him, their horses moving at the same easy walk, and she looked at his profile against the open sky and felt the full, clear certainty of something she had been building toward since the autumn morning on the trail when he had crouched beside her broken wheel and begun to work. "Ira," she said. He turned to look at her. "I love you," she said. She said it plainly and without ceremony, the way she said most true things, because she had found that ceremony often made true things harder to say and plain saying made them more real. I want to be honest about that because I think honesty between us is the thing I value most. He stopped his horse and she stopped hers, and they were side by side on the bank of the creek in the March light, and he looked at her for a long time with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, and that was the most open thing she had ever witnessed. "Winifred," he said, and the way he said her name, the weight and care of it, told her everything before the words did. "I have been trying to figure out how to say this to you since December, since Christmas Eve, since before that, since the morning on the trail when I looked up from that wheel and found you standing there watching me, and I thought." He stopped. He looked at the creek. He looked back at her. "I thought, there she is," he said simply. "Without knowing you at all, I thought, there she is." She felt the tears before she was aware of deciding to cry, the bright, sudden kind that come with strong, true feeling. "That's more than enough words," she said. He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, her mittened hand in his gloved one, and they sat like that on the bank of the spring creek with the cottonwoods budding around them and the hawks turning in the clean air above. And Winifred thought her father's words about the world looking cleaner after a hard thing survived. And she thought that the hard thing she had survived was not just grief, but the long, careful work of becoming herself without the person who had taught her how. And the world on the other side of it was very clean indeed. He asked her to marry him on the 3rd Sunday of April. He had thought about it in the way he thought about everything, which was to say carefully and thoroughly and without haste, and he asked her in the evening on the porch of the store, with the spring air full of the smell of new grass and the sound of the creek running high. And he asked her in plain words that said exactly what they meant, which was that he wanted to build a life with her in this place, that he had been building toward a permanent thing for the first time in his life, and she was the reason for it. And that he would spend whatever years were given to him trying to be worthy of the trust she placed in him. She said yes before he finished. He laughed, which was a sound she had not heard from him before, a real, unguarded laugh surprised out of him by her quickness, and it was the best sound she had heard in Kansas. "You didn't let me finish," he said. "You didn't need to," she said. "I already knew the rest." They were married in the middle of May, in the small church in Beaumont's Crossing, with the pastor presiding and the whole town, more or less, in attendance, because news of this kind moved through a small community with the efficient thoroughness of water finding every available crack. Margaret Cobb cried and Harlan shook Ira's hand with the solemn sincerity of a man welcoming him into the community's permanent account. Della Marsh stood beside Winifred and held her flowers and told her afterward that she had known since the day of the broken wheel, when Winifred had described a man who worked in silence and tipped his hat, that something would come of it. "That's very wise of you," Winifred said, "and you could have told me sooner and saved me several months of being sensible." "Being sensible was good for you," Della said cheerfully. "You arrived at the right place without rushing. That's how it should be. Cyrus Marsh had quietly offered them the use of a small house on the edge of his property that had been sitting empty, a three-room dwelling that had been built solidly and needed only cleaning and the specific kind of attention that a person with Ira's skills could provide. Ira spent the 2 weeks before the wedding making the house ready, and what he did to it in those 2 weeks was not merely repair, but a kind of caring attention applied to every surface and joint, so that by the time Winifred first walked through the door as its resident, the house felt as though it had been built to be exactly what it was. She walked through and touched the walls and the new shelving he had installed and the repaired stone of the fireplace, and she said, "You made it a home before I arrived." He stood in the doorway, where the afternoon light came in behind him, and he said, "I tried to make it something worth arriving to." She crossed the room and put her arms around him, which was an act she had been restraining for several months and which felt now in this room, in the warm afternoon, like the most natural thing she had ever done. He held her with a steadiness that was entirely characteristic of everything he was, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed. Summer moved over the Kansas plain with the full-scale ambition of plains summers, the heat building day by day to an intensity that turned the grass gold and made the noon air shimmer above the trail, and Beaumont's Crossing went about its seasonal life with the businesslike energy of a cattle trail town in its productive season. Winifred's days had a shape now that she had made herself. In the mornings she taught the school, which was full in summer only until the harvest season came and the older children were needed on the family land. In the afternoons she kept the mercantile books, which Harlan Cobb increasingly left entirely to her discretion, having established to his complete satisfaction that her discretion was better than his. In the evenings she was home. Home was a word that had new weight in her now. She had not had a home, properly speaking, since her father died and she had sold his house along with the store, and the return of it, the specific domestic reality of a space that was hers and that someone waited in, was something she felt with a quiet daily gratitude that she tried not to take for granted. Ira worked, as he had always worked, the particular patchwork of skilled tasks that made him valuable to nearly everyone in the town. He had formalized his arrangement with Cyrus Marsh into something closer to a partnership, with specific responsibilities at the livery that came with regular pay, and the understanding that Cyrus intended eventually to hand the business to someone who cared for it properly, and Ira was the only candidate who met that description. He still did work for others around town, still appeared on rooftops and at fence lines and in paddocks wherever something needed attention, and people had stopped being surprised by this and simply accepted it as one of the reliable features of their community. He came home in the evening smelling of sawdust or horse, or the specific combination of oil and iron that came from working with machinery, and they ate supper together at the table he had built in the first week of June from timber he had sourced and cut himself, and the suppers were the best part of her day. They talked at supper in the way that two people who understand each other talk, with the easy movement between practical matters and deeper things that requires no transition, because the connection is continuous. She told him about the children and the books and the arguments of the town council, and he told her about the horses and the work and the observations he had made during the day about the state of things, which were always precise and often surprising. He had, she discovered, a quiet and completely unexpected sense of humor that emerged occasionally in a single dry sentence that made her laugh out loud, and that he delivered with a face of absolute seriousness. She began, without quite meaning to look forward to those moments as one of the specific pleasures of her days, in the same category as the first cup of coffee in the morning and the particular light on the plain at evening. Autumn came, and with it the harvest and the end of the school term and the last of the cattle drives, and the town settled into its winter rhythms, and Winifred discovered in October that she was expecting a child. She told Ira on a quiet Sunday evening, sitting by the fire, with the sound of the wind outside the solid walls of their house and the warmth inside entirely real. She told him simply and directly, as she told him everything. He was still for a moment in the way he sometimes went still when something reached him deeply, and then he put down the piece of harness he had been mending and looked at her with an expression that made everything in the room very vivid. He crossed to her and knelt beside her chair and took her hands and held them and looked at her, and his eyes were the most open she had ever seen them. "Are you well?" he asked, which was exactly the right first question, and she loved him enormously for it. "I'm very well," she said. "I feel fine. I've spoken to the doctor and he's satisfied." He turned her hands over in his and looked at them and then looked at her face. "A child," he said, as though the word required testing. "In the spring," she said. "April or May, the doctor thinks." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the particular quality of wonder that he very rarely showed, "I didn't know I wanted this until I had a reason to." She leaned forward and put her forehead against his, and they stayed like that, very close, very still, while the fire crackled and the wind moved outside, and she felt the complete, rounded warmth of the moment in the way you feel things that are exactly what they should be. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was hard in the way Kansas winters were hard, with long cold spells and frozen ground, and the particular bleakness that comes in February when the cold has been going on long enough that it begins to feel permanent. But the house was warm and solid, and Ira was present in the way she had learned was his particular gift, not just physically present but wholly there, aware of her and attentive to her in a way that did not smother but sustained. He built a cradle from ash wood he had been seasoning since August, working on it in the evenings by lamplight with the careful, intent attention he brought to all craft, and she watched him sometimes from her chair across the room with the specific tenderness of watching someone you love do something that matters to them. "You've made it beautiful," she told him, looking at the finished cradle in the March light, the smooth curves of the headboard, the turned spindles, the slight groove worn into the corner of the runner by the drawknife. "I made it sturdy," he said. "The rest is just what happens when you take time." "The rest is beautiful," she maintained. He looked at the cradle and then at her. "You're partial," he said, with that slight corner of the mouth expression. "Completely," she agreed. "It doesn't make me wrong." Their son was born in the last week of April, during a night of spring rain that fell steadily and peacefully on the roof of the house and made the new world outside smell of wet earth and new grass. The doctor came, and Della Marsh came, and Margaret Cobb came, and Ira waited in the front room with a particular stillness that Della described afterward as the most intense stillness she had ever witnessed in a human being. When the doctor came and told him his wife was well and he had a son, Ira sat down in his chair and put his face in his hands for a moment, and Della said she would not describe what she saw when he lifted it again, because she was not in the habit of discussing the private expressions of private people. But she told Winifred later, when Winifred pressed her, that it was everything good. They named him James for Winifred's father, and the second name was Gentry, carried forward as a middle name so that her father's name stayed in the world. James Gentry Dalton arrived in the spring of 1876 and was, from his first days, a person of strong opinions expressed with great volume and a specific physical solidity that suggested he had inherited his father's constitution, along with his mother's stubborn self-possession. He was dark-eyed and loud and healthy, and Ira held him with a careful, complete attention that made Winifred, watching from the bed where she was recovering, feel that her heart was too large for its ordinary container. "He looks like you," she said. Ira looked up from the baby's face and he was smiling, a full, real, unmanaged smile, the kind she now knew was his rarest and best thing. "He looks like himself," he said. "He's just arrived. Give him time." "He has your eyes," she insisted. "Then he'll see clearly," he said, and she laughed, which hurt but was entirely worth it. The spring and summer of 1876 moved through Beaumont's Crossing with the deepened pleasure of people who had something new and real to be happy about. James Dalton was a vigorous presence in their household and in the town, where he was admired by practically everyone in the way that healthy babies are admired in communities that have experienced their share of hard things and know the value of new life when they see it. Winifred returned to teaching in September, with an arrangement by which Della Marsh's youngest sister, a cheerful and competent girl of 17 named Rosa, came each morning to mind James during the school hours. She returned to the mercantile books in the afternoons with James sleeping in the basket Ira had made and fitted to a corner of the back room. She found that motherhood, far from diminishing her capacity for work, had sharpened her efficiency in the way that important additions to your life sometimes force a useful reorganization of everything else. The town was growing. New families arrived through 1876 and into 1877, drawn by the railroad survey that Ira had predicted at supper 2 years before, and that was now a working line that stopped at Beaumont's Crossing 3 times a week and brought with it goods and people, and the specific energy of connectivity. The town put up new buildings, and the school enrollment grew, and the mercantile's business expanded in a way that validated everything Winifred had been doing with the accounts, and suggested that Harlan Cobb's tentative mention of a partnership stake had not been idle conversation. She broached the subject in October of 1876, with the same directness she applied to all business matters, and Cobb, who had been hoping she would stay and had been wondering how to ensure it, accepted her terms without significant argument. She became a 1/5 partner in Beaumont's Crossing Mercantile, which was a fact she noted in the ledger with her own hand, and which she told Ira about at supper that evening with a satisfaction she did not attempt to diminish. He lifted his coffee cup to her across the table. "You've been running it for a year," he said. "Now it says so in writing," she said. "Good," he said simply, and that was enough. The years that followed were the years in which Beaumont's Crossing became genuinely permanent, and in which the Dalton household became one of those fixtures of a community that are stable and generous enough to be leaned on. James grew into a bright, active child with his father's capacity for focused attention and his mother's gift for clear expression, a combination that made him formidable in the schoolroom and beloved outside of it. He was interested in horses with a passionate specificity that surprised no one, and followed Ira around the livery, with the devoted apprentice energy of someone who has found his subject. Winifred taught at the school for 5 years, and then stepped back from teaching when her own workload at the mercantile demanded her full attention. But she remained on the town's education board and had opinions about curriculum and funding that were well known and acted upon. Her partnership share in the mercantile expanded in 1879 when Edgar Cobb married and moved to Wichita and sold his share back into the business. And by 1880, she and Harlan Cobb were equal partners in a store that served the whole of the surrounding country. Ira took over the livery formally in 1878 when Cyrus Marsh's health began to fail, and Cyrus accepted the inevitable with the practical good grace of a man who had planned for it. The transition was clean and complete, with Cyrus retaining a small financial interest and no practical responsibility, which seemed to satisfy both parties entirely. Della and Cyrus remained in their house, and Della remained Winifred's closest friend, and the arrangement of their families, 2 households close and easy with each other, became one of the defining textures of life in Beaumont's Crossing. In the spring of 1879, their daughter arrived, named Clara Margaret, the Margaret for Mrs. Cobb, who had been quietly essential to the Dalton household since the beginning, and who wept with sincere pleasure when she was told the name. Clara was a different creature from her brother, quieter and more watchful, with her mother's organizational instinct and a specific, focused curiosity about the natural world that led her to collect rocks and identify plants, and asked questions about the creek's behavior in different seasons that nobody in the family could fully answer. James was 3 when Clara was born, and his initial skepticism gave way within a week to the proprietary devotion of an older brother, who has decided that the new arrival is specifically his responsibility. He brought Clara rocks for her collection, and when she was old enough to appreciate it, taught her the names of the horses at the livery with the pedagogical seriousness of someone who considers this information essential. One evening in the autumn of 1879, when James was 3 and Clara was a few months old and the harvest was in, and the town was settling into its comfortable winter preparations, Winifred came home from the mercantile to find Ira sitting on the porch steps in the cool early evening with Clara asleep against his chest, and James sitting beside him looking at the stars beginning to appear over the plain, and the scene was so exactly right. So precisely the picture of what she had not known she was building toward in all the years before she arrived in Kansas, that she stopped in the path and just looked at it. Ira heard her stop and turned to look at her over his shoulder. He saw something in her face. He said, quietly so as not to wake Clara, "You all right?" "Better than that," she said. He looked at her for another moment in that honest, complete way, and then he moved aside on the step so there was room and tilted his head toward the space, the simple gesture meaning what it always meant, which was "come here." She sat beside him on the step, and he put his arm around her, and James leaned against her other side and said, "Mama, I found the Big Dipper," and pointed up with great certainty at a part of the sky that may or may not have been the right part of the sky, and she looked up and agreed with him entirely. The stars were very large and very close over the Kansas plain in the autumn of 1879, and the town below them was full of light and the sound of lives being lived, and Winifred Dalton, who had been Winifred Gentry when a broken wagon wheel changed the trajectory of everything, sat on her own porch steps with her husband's arm around her and her children beside her, and felt the world as clean and whole as it had ever been. In 1880, on a warm September morning, Winifred was at the mercantile dealing with a new shipment of goods that had come in on the Tuesday train when the door opened, and a young woman came in with the particular look of someone who had come a long way and was not sure they had arrived at the right place. She was perhaps 20 years old, alone, carrying a carpet bag, and she had the combination of determination and exhaustion on her face that Winifred recognized immediately, because she had worn it herself when she walked through this same door 6 years ago. She went to the woman directly, the way she wished someone had come to her, and said, "You've just arrived, haven't you? Can I help you find something?" The young woman, whose name was Hannah Prout, and who had come from St. Louis following a letter about work at the land office that turned out to be less than accurately described, looked at Winifred with a relief that was almost painful to see. Winifred brought her to the back of the store and gave her a cup of coffee and listened to her situation with full attention, and then she made 3 practical suggestions, one of which was that the school, which had expanded to 2 sessions and needed an afternoon teacher, was currently looking for candidates, and that she happened to be on the board and would be glad to make an introduction. Hannah Prout became the afternoon teacher in October 1880 and proved to be excellent at it, and stayed in Beaumont's Crossing, and 3 years later married the hardware merchant's son, but that is another story. What is this story is the evening of that September day when Winifred came home and told Ira about Hannah Prout. He listened in the way he always listened, completely, and at the end he said, "You saw yourself in her." "I did," she said. "What did you do when you arrived?" he asked. "Harlan Cobb was kind to me," she said, "and Della and you." He looked at her and she looked at him across the supper table with the lamplight between them, and she thought about a Kansas trail in the autumn of 1874, and a broken wheel, and a man who crouched beside it without a word and fixed it without asking anything in return, and tipped his hat and started to ride away. "You started it," she said, "on the trail." He looked slightly uncomfortable in the way he sometimes did when she pointed this out, as though the credit was more than he felt was accurate. "I fixed a wheel," he said. "You fixed a wheel and tipped your hat and rode away," she said, "and I watched you go and thought, there is a man who does things worth doing and asks nothing for them, and I wanted to know everything about a man like that." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them cast a warm, specific light. "You know everything now," he said. "Not everything," she said. "We have time." He smiled, that full, rare, real smile, and said, "We do." They did. The years continued, and the town continued, and the Dalton family continued within it, roots going deeper with each season, James growing into a capable, lanky boy of 10, and then 12 who had his father's way with horses and his mother's way with arithmetic, and who was, by 12, already spending his mornings at the livery and his evenings reading every book that came through the mercantile, which his mother allowed him to borrow with the understanding that he would discuss them with her after. Clara grew into a serious, clear-eyed girl who continued to collect rocks with a scientific rigor that suggested a future direction her parents discussed with interest and encouragement. In 1882, a geologist came through Beaumont's crossing on his way to survey the territory and spent 3 days in town, and Clara, who was 8, cornered him at the mercantile counter and asked him 6 questions about limestone formation in the creek bed that made the man look at her parents with an expression of considerable surprise. He sent her, 2 months later, a book on geology from Denver that was years beyond her current reading level, and that she read with the focused determination of someone who intends to get there. In 1883, a 3rd child arrived, a son they called Robert, for no one in particular but the name suited him, and he arrived with a disposition so cheerful and an energy so immediate that the household adapted to him as a household adapts to weather, with a mixture of admiration and acceptance. Robert Dalton was interested in everything and afraid of nothing, and by the time he was walking he was following both his father and his older brother with equal enthusiasm and no discrimination. The mercantile prospered and expanded. Harlan Cobb retired in 1884 in good health and reasonable contentment, and left his share formally to Winifred, which made her the principal owner of what was now the largest and most efficiently run commercial establishment in the county. She did not change the name immediately, and when she finally changed it to Dalton's Mercantile, it was because the sign had needed replacing anyway, and she saw no point in repainting the old name. Ira said nothing when she told him about the name, but there was something in his face, private and pleased, and she knew what it meant. The livery under his management had become something more than a livery. He had expanded it to include a proper farrier operation and a repair shop for wagons and agricultural equipment, and he employed 3 men and trained them with the patient, thorough approach he brought to all instruction. He had a reputation across the county for honest work and fair dealing, and a particular gift with difficult horses that brought animals from as far as 2 counties away. He was not a man who sought reputation, but he was a man whose character was impossible to conceal, and reputation found him regardless. He was well into his 40s by the mid-1880s, and the weathering that the Kansas years added to a face that had already been shaped by the outdoor life of a working cowboy gave him a look that Winifred, who was entirely biased and knew it, found more compelling with each passing year. She told him this once, and he looked at her with the slightly skeptical expression he used when he thought she was being more generous than accurate. "You're looking at something that got left in the sun," he said. "I'm looking at a man I know inside and out," she said, "and I know what I'm looking at." He accepted this, as he accepted most things she said with full conviction, which was to say quietly and with a nod and a slight easing of whatever he was holding. The summers on the plain were long and the winters were cold, and the work of life in Beaumont's Crossing was real and continuous and occasionally very hard, and sometimes things were lost, as things are always lost, and sometimes the grief was sharp, as grief is always sharp. But the framework they had built together was solid in the way of things built carefully and without haste, and it held through the difficult seasons, the way Ira's repair of her wagon wheel had held through 14 miles of rough trail and considerably further, because the work had been done right the first time. James Dalton, at 17, was a young man who could shoe a horse and read a ledger and discuss American history with more nuance than most adults his mother knew. He was making serious plans for the livery and had already been helping run it in practice for 2 years, and the understanding between him and his father about the future of the business was one of those understandings that doesn't require much speech, because it has been built into the daily fabric of two people's shared work. Clara, at 15, had written to the geologist who had sent her the book, now an established scientist in Denver, and received a reply that contained 3 further reading recommendations and the information that the university in Lawrence was accepting women students in certain programs. She had put this letter on the kitchen table and looked at her parents across it and said nothing, in a way that was so completely her father's way that both Winifred and Ira recognized it immediately and looked at each other over her head. "Lawrence is close enough for visits," Winifred said. Clara exhaled. "We'll talk to the university," Ira said. Clara picked up the letter and held it very carefully. Robert, at 7, was investigating whether frogs could be kept in the back paddock of the livery, and had strong opinions about the answer that were not shared by anyone else in the family. On a September evening in 1888, which was a good year in Kansas, warm and productive, with the crops well and the cattle market favorable, and the town well into its second decade of permanence, Winifred and Ira sat on the porch of their house in the cool evening. The children were inside, James reading, Clara writing a letter, Robert asleep with the total abruptness of a child who has spent his whole body's energy and collapsed without warning. The stars were coming out over the plain in the way they did, enormous and uncountable, the Milky Way a wash of light across the dark. They sat in the quiet that was theirs by long practice and long preference, the comfortable silence of two people who have spent enough years together that the silence has become a language of its own, full of everything that does not need to be said because it is known. Winifred thought, sitting there, about the distance they had traveled from the autumn morning on the trail. She thought about the woman she had been then, composed and practical and alone, with $63 in her boot and a broken wheel, and no particular reason to expect anything from the world, except what she could make of it herself. She thought about how she had watched a man ride away on a dark bay horse and felt something she could not name, and how she had arrived in this town and learned his name and learned the shape of his character in pieces, the way you learn a landscape, one detail at a time until the whole is clear. She thought about how the whole, when it became clear, was more than she had known to hope for. "Ira," she said. He turned to look at her. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her with a slight crease between his brows that meant he wasn't sure what specifically he was being thanked for. "For stopping on the trail," she said. "For fixing the wheel, for all of it." His expression shifted into something that she knew well, that private, genuine quality that was the deepest version of what he carried. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the evening light, and then he said, "I almost didn't stop." She looked at him. This was something he had never said before. "I saw the wagon," he said, "and I saw a woman alone, and I thought it wasn't my business." He paused. "Then I thought about what it would mean to ride past someone who needed help because it was easier." He looked at the stars. "That didn't sit." "So you stopped," she said. "So I stopped," he said. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had been taking his hand for 14 years, the large, warm, work-roughened hand that she knew better than her own, and she held it. 14 years, she said. James and Clara and Robert, the store and the livery and this house, everything. He turned her hand over in his and looked at it and then looked at her. "Everything," he agreed. The evening deepened around them, and the stars burned overhead, and the town lay quiet below, and inside their house, their children were the particular proof of a life well made. And Winifred sat in the cool September air and felt the full, deep weight of contentment, not the absence of difficulty or the fantasy of ease, but the real thing, the kind that is built from work and honesty and the choice, made continuously over 14 years, to be present to another person with everything you have. The dark bay horse with the white blaze was long retired, at 22 years old, to an easy life in the livery paddock where James fed him apples and where Robert had, with great effort and limited success, attempted to teach him tricks. Ira still went to see him most evenings, the horse putting his nose over the paddock rail in the way he had developed over 22 years of being a horse who was reliably treated well by his person, and Ira would stand there for a few minutes in the quiet and run a hand along the horse's neck. Winifred had found him there one evening earlier in the summer and stood watching from the gate without announcing herself. She had watched him with the horse in the fading light, the old horse and the man who had ridden him across the Kansas plain for more years than she had known him, and she had thought about all the miles that had led to a particular morning on a particular trail, a broken wheel, a silence, a tipped hat. He had turned and seen her, and his face had done what it always did when he saw her after any absence, even an hour's absence, which was to settle into the expression she thought of as entirely his own, the one that had no name but that she recognized as clearly as her own name spoken. She had opened the gate and walked across the paddock and stood beside him at the fence, and the old horse had snuffled at her shoulder with the familiarity of a very old friend. "He remembers you," Ira said. "He was there from the beginning," she said. Ira looked at the horse and then at her. "So was I," he said in the dry, quiet way that was his particular brand of humor. "Barely," she said. "You tipped your hat and tried to ride away." "I came back," he said. "You always do," she said. He put his arm around her, and they stood at the paddock fence in the evening light with the old horse between them and the plains stretching away in all directions under the enormous sky. And it was enough. And it was everything. And it was exactly the life she had not known she was riding toward when Abraham and Mary pulled the wagon west into the Kansas autumn 14 years ago with $63 in her boot, and everything still to discover. In the spring of 1889, the year Clara left for Lawrence and the university, and Robert turned 8 and became fractionally less interested in frogs in favor of a deep fascination with the steam engines that came through on the railroad, and James turned 23 and formally stepped into the livery partnership and began talking with great seriousness about a young woman named Alice Thorne whose father ran the mill outside of town. Winifred and Ira planted a garden behind the house. It was not the first garden they had planted. They had made attempts at gardens before with varying success, the climate and the demands of daily life conspiring against the more ambitious projects. But this year they built it properly, with a frame and a fence against the rabbits and a water system that Ira designed and James helped dig, and they planted it in April with the particular optimism of people who have enough confidence in their future to put seeds in the ground. By June it was growing. Beans and squash and a row of sunflowers along the south fence that bloomed by late summer in the specific extravagant yellow that is the most cheerful color on the Kansas plain. Clara came home in August, brown from the summer and full of the compressed energy of a young woman who has had her mind expanded significantly and is figuring out how to bring it home with her. She stood in the garden in the August light and looked at the sunflowers with the considering expression she brought to everything and said, "They're heliotropic, they track the sun." "I know," Winifred said. "How do they know which way it is?" "I don't," Winifred said. "Maybe that's a thing to look into." Clara looked at her with a smile that was entirely her father's. "Maybe it is," she said. Ira was in the garden later that evening, staking the beans that had gotten ahead of themselves, and Winifred came out with 2 cups of coffee, and they stood among the growing things in the evening warmth with the sunflowers throwing long shadows east and the creek audible somewhere behind the cottonwoods, and she thought that the garden was a good metaphor for everything, the patient work and the willingness to wait and the astonishing fidelity of living things to the direction of the light. "It's a good garden," she said. "It needed time," he said. "Most things do." She handed him his coffee. He took it and she stood beside him with the evening coming in and the garden around them, and the house behind them with the lights coming on inside where Robert was at the kitchen table and Clara was somewhere with her books, and the full, warm, breathing reality of it was present and complete. She thought of the trail, the broken wheel, the silence, the battered hat tipped in a gesture so spare and dignified that it had contained more courtesy than most speeches. She thought of the rider growing smaller against the pale sky, and how she had watched him longer than she needed to, and how something in her had already known, before she knew his name or his voice or the particular quality of his attention, that the man riding away on the dark bay horse was a man worth finding. She found him. He stayed. The wheel held. Everything she needed to know about the shape of a life was there in those three plain facts, and she had been grateful for them every day since, and she would be grateful for them for all the days still to come, in this town, in this house, with this man, under the enormous, unhurried sky of Kansas that had witnessed all of it and said nothing and was, like him, entirely sufficient in its silence. Robert appeared at the back door and called that supper was burning, which it was not, but the announcement served its purpose, and they went inside together into the warm light, and the door closed behind them, and the garden stood in the last of the evening sun, the sunflowers turning one final degree toward the west, tracking the light with the perfect, faithful instinct of things that know exactly where their warmth comes from.